Whew. Frosthaven is more than just Gloomhaven with different classes. It features rules changes and some gameplay additions, and it's like 7 pounds heavier. Seriously though, there's a little bit more than just seeing some obvious changes like the event decks being summer and winter, but there's some subtle rules changes, and we're going to be going over both the high level differences and low level differences between Gloomhaven and Frosthaven. If you want to be kept up to date with all things Frosthaven, be sure to subscribe. If you enjoy Gloomhaven and adjacent content, consider joining our Discord or supporting us on Patreon. When you visit Frosthaven, there's a 5-part Outpost Phase: the passage of time, the Outpost event, building operations, downtime, and construction. In Gloomhaven, this would be kind of like returning to Gloomhaven, drawing a city event, and then doing all the Gloomhaven activities. Most of those are just compiled under the downtime event in this, but I'm going to break down each phase in a spoiler-free fashion. The passage of time. This is the first step. Some parts of the calendar have specific events. Every 10 passage of time checks results in a change of season, so you can swap out your event decks with the other season, as well as other changes that are on there. I'm not going to get into the details of those. You'll discover them as you play the campaign. The second step is the Outpost event. Some of them are attack events. Attack events can result in buildings becoming wrecked, players forced to spend resources, or morale decreasing. Morale can affect certain things, as well as Frosthaven's ability to defend against future attacks. Building operations is the third step. Over the course of the campaign, as you construct buildings, you'll create a building deck of all the cards for your buildings. You'll go through these one by one and perform every operation, sometimes getting a lot of free stuff. The fourth step is downtime. Downtime is what people are probably most familiar if you've played Gloomhaven before. This is where you'll level up your characters, purchase items, craft, and whatnot. So as long as you have the ability to spend resources and do all sorts of things, you can even contribute towards Frosthaven to help constructing buildings, which is in the next step. Step 5 is construction. You can build 1 or 2 buildings, and you can either build, upgrade, or rebuild, and you can do only 1 to 2 total of these, so you can't do, for example, all 3. I'm not going to get into too much detail about construction, but you'll discover it as we go through the campaign, but this will be done at the very end of the Outpost Phase. The second big change is Town Guard and Outpost Defense. You'll build up a Town Guard deck, which is just like an attack modifier deck, starting with 20 cards, and as Frosthaven, you'll develop perks, and your guards get better and or more consistent depending on what you do to build up your ability to defend against future attacks. So building up your Town Guard is very important, as well as keeping their morale high, which will determine their base ability to fend off enemies. The third big change is resources, looting, and crafting. Although you'll still be able to purchase some items with gold, and you'll get some gold through adventuring, monsters will drop loot tokens, and you'll construct a loot deck. The loot deck will be built every scenario when you set it up, and it'll tell you which loot cards to draw and shuffle in together. You'll discover over the course of playing the campaign that certain areas, such as like unfettered factories, will have lots of metal, and certain areas like the woods will have more wood. And there'll be more nuance than just that. I don't want to spoil it too much, but certain scenarios you might lean like, hey, I want to be able to craft X. Maybe let's head in this direction, and drive the campaign there to make sure you get that one cool item. Additionally, these resources you get will be used to craft potions with your fun alchemy, as well as construct the buildings within Frosthaven themselves. Frosthaven features a new card format that's different than Gloomhaven. A lot of it's very similar, and there's been some small discussion with the community and with a little bit of mixed reception. It's definitely something that when you're first trying it out, feels perhaps a little jarring if you've played the other format. A lot of times when we've introduced people to this format directly, we haven't had very noticeable differences at all. As a matter of fact, most of the time when we show people the old format, it feels archaic. Matter of fact, this should also help with localization, so we can get Frosthaven into more languages. Some cards, like on the Blinkblade and a couple luck classes that I'm not going to mention, some cards just using the old method can't fit what they can do on using the old method. This opens up a lot of design space for Isaac to create much more interesting cards. Additionally, those people with reading difficulties might find it easier to just read icons instead of trying to read whole text. Although in some cases, some wordy cards will still have to have text to have their rules effects. A significant change in Frosthaven is how rolling modifiers interact with advantage and disadvantage. Previously, you would draw precisely 2 cards with advantage or disadvantage. If neither cards had rolling modifiers, you would compare the two and choose the greater result for advantage or the lesser result for disadvantage. If it was ambiguous, the first card drawn was used. If one card drawn was rolling and the other was not, the non-rolling card was always used. With advantage, you'd also add the other rolling modifier drawn to that card, whereas with disadvantage, you'd discard the rolling modifier and just use the other card drawn. If both cards were rolling, you'd continue to draw until you'd finally draw a non-rolling card. The final card would always be the card used regardless of advantage or disadvantage. With disadvantage, you would discard all of the rolling modifiers drawn, but with advantage, you'd apply all rolling modifiers to the final card. Although this usually worked out fine, it did often end up with strange situations where one could previously null-proof attacks with advantage, but then when you start adding rolling modifiers to your deck, it made nulls possible, and despite the fact that you've been improving your deck, accidentally rolling into a crit on disadvantage feels strange as well. Although fortuitous, some people found that confusing. The new advantage and disadvantage rules are quite simple, which is effectively you draw until you get exactly one non-rolling card and then draw precisely one more card after that. Let's break that down though. Instead of drawing two cards, you draw one and look at it. If it has the rolling icon, continue to draw. Repeat this process until you've finally drawn one card with no rolling modifiers. Regardless of how many cards were drawn in step 1, draw one additional attack modifier card. If this final card has a rolling modifier on it, ignore that part, and instead the card just becomes a base non-rolling card. For example, a rolling +1 would just become a +1. A rolling infused fire would just become a +0 infused fire, etc. Compare this final card with the card drawn directly before it. With advantage, you'll use the greater result of the two cards. If it is ambiguous, instead, you may select which of the two cards to use instead. With disadvantage, you'll use the worst of the two cards. If it is ambiguous, the final card drawn is discarded and you'll use the card drawn previously. Regardless of the results of the last comparison, you should have compared two cards and then selected one. At that point, look at all previously collected rolling modifiers, if any. With advantage, add all of them to the final result. With disadvantage, all of the rolling modifiers is discarded and ignored. Although a bit more wordy, it does at least make sense. There is always a comparison between two cards, and unless you are cursed or blessed, you shouldn't be able to draw a crit on disadvantage, and you shouldn't be able to draw a null on advantage. Additionally, the player's choice on advantage is much nicer, especially when some elements or status effects will go further than numeric values. Although invisibility is super powerful still, one significant change has made one use of it significantly worse. Players and monsters can now move through invisible foes with no penalty. Although there is one difference, you cannot end your movement on an invisible foe, and monsters no longer treat invisible foes as negative spaces. So previously, if there was a choke point at one area, specifically usually a door, invisible characters could effectively turn that into a negative space, turning the whole room behind it into a negative space, which could confuse monsters' behavior rules, which often led to them either not moving, not attacking, or both. Note this also applies to invisible enemies, so if you're surrounded by invisible night demons, you can actually just walk through them now, which is really nice. Unlocking classes is now story-driven. Mercenaries still do have personal quests and retire. No longer do Frosthaven mercenaries recruit other mercenaries to join. Instead, they settle down permanently in Frosthaven and build a structure when they're done. As they retire and you build more and more buildings, you're afforded more and more advancement, and these make gameplay a lot better. So you still want to retire because those buildings improve the prosperity of Frosthaven and give you more things to do during the Outpost Phase. The campaign will result in you adventuring in the frozen lands north of Gloomhaven or around Frosthaven. You'll encounter strange creatures like the Unfettered, the Algox, and Lurkers. Some of these are foes, but some of them are friendly and may end up joining Frosthaven. Additionally, there will be some familiar heritages like orchids or vermlings that will also join Frosthaven during the course of the campaign. The nice part about this is you no longer really feel compelled to play the class of the personal quest you just drew. A lot of times people play this and like, well, I guess I unlocked it, I should play it, even if it's not necessarily going to be their preferred playstyle. You'll actually be able to start unlocking classes earlier, so once you get to your retirement, you should actually have a choice of which classes you actually want to play, rather than just having like, well, we only have one new one, guess I'm playing that one. The card enhancement system has gotten a revamp. Losses are now cheaper to enhance by 50%, and disarm is no longer an enhancement type now. Boo. But we all know that was too powerful to begin with. Cards have different enhancement types, and there are different pips depending on the amount of sides they have. So certain pips will be able to just say only put +1s here, and some of them will allow negative or positive status effects. The really significant part is there are some cards that just were too powerful to have effects on them, such as I think a pretty big one is the Dirt Tornado from the Crag card. Although adding a +1 to this is still very good, a lot of people would add like Wound, Curse, or Disarm to it, making it way too powerful because a 7-hex Disarm or a 7-hex Curse or a 7-hex Wound is insane. Not only that, but a 7-hex Curse combined with Muddle is intensely effective and just ultimately ended up trivializing scenarios. So instead of just saying, well, we can't put a pip there, you can just, for example, put +1 pips there, and now at least you can enhance it, but you can't use the broken stuff. This really improves the ability for there to be more cards that can be enhanced without necessarily breaking the system. One small change: if you have an active summon and it cannot find a focus for whatever reason, usually due to there being no monsters on the board, you can elect to have the summon focus you instead and move forward towards you. This should help range summons catch up if you're lagging behind a little bit. In Gloomhaven, you had a city event deck and you had a road event deck. Frosthaven affords you the Outpost deck, of course, which you have in road events, but also you have summer and winter. Summer events are typically pretty solid and are nice. However, winter events are a bit more harsh. Luckily, you do start at the beginning of summer, so you have time to prepare for those cruel winter events. Some of the rules changes in Jaws of the Lion has become part of the core game, and I'll just go over these in small detail. No longer do you need to push and pull the full amount. If you only want to use part of it, for example a push 3, but you only want to use push 1, you can just push 1. Jump now ignores all difficult terrain, even the final hex. Now if you land in the final hex and there's a trap or hazardous, you'll still suffer the damage, but if you land in difficult terrain, you do not have to spend an extra hex of movement. Summoned monsters can now drop coins. Line of sight can now from any part of the hex and not just the corners. And if you loot a chest mid-scenario, you can immediately equip it. This even breaks the item slot restriction, so if you're already wearing a chest armor and you loot a chest armor, you temporarily for the rest of the scenario can equip that. After the scenario, you follow normal item restrictions. Creating characters a higher prosperity. No longer do you actually get the full prosperity for determining what maximum starting level your mercenary can start at. Now you can always start a character at level 1, that's not a problem. However, instead of full prosperity, you only get half rounded up. So not only that, the only time you can actually start using characters starting after level 1 is when you finally hit prosperity level 3. Towards the end of the campaign of Gloomhaven, a lot of us were like retiring and then immediately jumping into level 7 characters, which felt, sometimes just a bit much to try to learn the class and figure out how does this even work, and sometimes that just wasn't very fun. And some people just made a house rule where they're like, I'm just gonna start at a lower level just because I wanna like advance and level it up that way and maybe learn it. Well, no longer it's a house rule, it's part of Frosthaven. Half prosperity, so even if you do get to the maximum prosperity, the highest you can start a character from Frosthaven is at maximum prosperity level 5 instead of level 9. Battle goals. So Frosthaven has a lot more battle goals, but there's also another rule. Instead of drawing 2 and picking 1, you draw 3 and pick 1. It's pretty basic. However, because some of the battle goals are still pretty hard to get, drawing an additional one at least reduces the chance of, I can't do any of these. This should make it less annoying when trying to choose goals to advance your character's perks, as well as you'll be able to see more of them. Inspiration. Inspiration is a mechanic only if you play with fewer than 4 players, and this can vary from scenario to scenario. Each time you play a scenario, you gain inspiration equal to 4 minus the number of mercenaries that came. This is not players, mercenaries. So if you're normally doing a 4-player campaign and only 3 people showed up, you actually get a point of inspiration. So you accumulate inspiration until you accumulate 15 inspiration. Once a character retires and you have 15 or greater inspiration, you can draw an additional personal quest and complete that as well. So the cool part is a lot of people had 4-player groups that were just retiring more and more characters, unlocking more and more stuff, and then when you're doing 2-player, you're like, I'm feeling a little bit behind. So now 4-player parties, if you always play with 4 players, are never really going to have to deal with inspiration, and you're not going to get some acceleration this way. However, 3 and 2-player groups are going to get a little bit of catch up to make sure that you don't miss out on unlocking parts of the box that other 4-player parties might have done. Multi-use items refresh on a long rest even if you haven't spent all the charges. This is a very common house rule and sometimes an accidental house rule. Now items, usually armors with multiple charges, such as like hide armor from the original Gloomhaven, can refresh on a long rest even if you haven't spent all the charges. Like some of the higher items that had lots of charges, but then between long rest not actually suffering enough attacks to trigger it, and then actually having it be worse than other armors because you didn't use enough charges between rests to get it back to the beginning. That's no longer going to be a problem. Even if you haven't fully spent any of the items that you have, like you have some charges left, just reset it every time you long rest. Another relatively small change, end of round bonuses can no longer be dismissed. They last until the end of the round and you cannot dismiss it early, but if they do have the infinity symbol, those persistent bonuses, they can be dismissed whenever, so that's cool. For example, if you would activate a card that says you get +2 to all attacks this turn, you can't, like, for example, dismiss it early and then drink a stamina potion to get it back immediately. You have to let it persist until the end of the round, in which case it'll be a little bit too late to stamina potion. But don't worry, some other permanent effects that you can dismiss and get back with stam potions still exist, such as the Mind Thief's Augments or the Bone Shaper Summons. You can just dismiss those at no penalty. There are new status effects in Frosthaven: Bane, Brittle, Impair, and Ward. Ward is the only good one out of all of these, so let's go over that first. Ward says the next time you would suffer damage, you would lose Ward but then reduce the damage by half, rounding down. So the nice part is this can effectively crit proof you, so if you like take an attack 4 and boom, it's a crit, and it would normally be 8 damage, it actually is just 4 damage in a ward. But also, it says any source of damage, so if you ward yourself and go through a trap, you can reduce trap damage by half, or if you suffer like a large attack, cutting it in half is pretty nice. Impaired just says you cannot use items while impaired, and then the next time you end your turn, it goes away. The annoying part about this is this gets way more punishing with higher prosperity as you get a lot of items. Frosthaven with the crafting and all the alchemy and stuff you can do, you can get really cool items. But then saying you can't use it this turn is particularly annoying. Also, there are some enemies that have impair on all of their attacks, so as long as they like magnetize you and keep impairing you, you might actually be in a really bad position. This makes some of these enemies particularly terrifying. Brittle is like the opposite of Ward. The next time you would suffer damage, you lose Brittle, but then double the damage. So if you do have Brittle and Ward, they just cancel each other out. The next time you suffer damage, lose both. However, if you get healed while you have Brittle, Brittle is removed. Brittle also, unlike Poison, does not block healing. And the last and probably most deadly of the negative status effects introduced in Frosthaven is Bane. Bane just says, the next time you would end your turn, suffer 10 damage. Now, like a lot of times in our groups we're playing, Bane usually said the next time you'd end your turn with Bane, lose a card, because most of the time we just never would want to suffer the 10 damage or we couldn't survive it. It's not very common though, so don't worry too much. Like Brittle, if you get healed while you have Bane, it does go away, and again, Bane does not block healing like Poison does. So yeah, that's a lot of changes, and I'm actually really excited because a lot of these changes are definitely for the better. I personally love all the rules changes, and adding a lot of the outpost changes just really makes it feel just that much more fresh. Like, I know a lot of times I really enjoyed Gloomhaven's tactical combat, but then outside the combat it was like, hey, does anyone want to buy it? I don't know. It's just very meh, we can go to the next scenario, and just not a lot. And we never felt super attached to Gloomhaven, so I'm particularly excited to play through Frosthaven and see how that campaign works out. If you'd like to weigh in on your thoughts on certain rules changes, leave a comment. We're going to be doing a lot of Frosthaven videos in the upcoming months, so be sure to subscribe if you want more Frosthaven content, and if you have some of your own suggestions, be sure to leave a comment. If you want to support the channel, consider supporting it on Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, thank you to all of our Inox tier patrons. We really appreciate your support. Thank you for leaving some feedback in terms of what videos you want to see, and I'll be taking that, and we'll be doing a few of those going forward. Additionally, I will be doing a little bit more patron-only videos, including some of my playtester insights into some of the classes. So I just want to thank all of you for supporting the channel, and thank all of you for watching. I should have practiced more, but I have a meeting in 45 minutes. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was recording. I kind of this up. I'm gonna redo that. Card, good start. All right. Okay, just okay. Kind of went off script there too. Continuing. We'll see which one of those sound better. All right, I think that went well. Hopefully.